Institute. Now, just to break it down for us at this hour, I have Tim Christopherson, who is from the United Nations Environment, also the researcher of the Landscape Restoration Report. Tim, good to see you. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
Perhaps before you give us a highlight of this report that is going to be released tomorrow, can you perhaps tell us what are some of the emerging issues in Africa with regards to environment?
First of all, Kenya and Nairobi is, of course, the seat of the UN headquarters in Africa. This is why we're launching this report here. We're having 800 people join us, and Kenya is one of the few countries that has a constitutional goal of restoring tree and forest cover. And that's, of course, very valuable. Emerging issues for Africa are that land degradation costs the continent more in economic damage than all the official development assistance flowing to Africa. It's about 20% more damage that is done by degrading land, erosion, losing soil fertility. So we have to reverse that trend, not only to secure millions of rural jobs, but also to secure food and water security in Africa.
Yeah, and speaking about one of the emerging issues that everybody talks about when it comes to conserving environment is issues to do with illegal logging. It's about 50% in countries like Cameroon, 80% in Liberia. I don't know the statistics in Kenya, but I understand that the government has already banned, logging in the country. So if you ask all these people who are engaged in illegal logging, they'll tell you the reason as to why they do this is because of poverty. Do you think governments, perhaps non-governmental organizations need to address poverty in order to save the environment in a way?
Absolutely, and the beauty of this concept of forest and landscape restoration is that, of course, in a few years' time we can employ a lot more people on the same amount of land. We can produce a lot more food. We can have more water coming from Kenya's water towers to feed East Africa rivers. So it's a positive development that we're trying to turn this into. At the moment, by further degrading the natural resources, even the people who are engaged in illegal charcoal burning, illegal logging, will eventually lose their livelihoods. So we have to invest, and there are also private investors, even foreign direct investment, that's interested to come into Kenya, other African countries. For that, of course, we have to ensure that there's good rule of law, that there's no corruption. So I think we're on a good way. And Kenya Forest Service is also actively tackling these issues, is actively investing in forest and landscape restoration in Kenya.
Fantastic. Now, whenever we talk about environment, I'm sure you'll agree with me that not just in Kenya, but by extension in the whole continent, we always get these griming, deadly statistics that, we are endangering the forest in this continent. Perhaps have we made any strides in Africa? Are there any positives when it comes to conservation? Are there success stories out there?
There are success stories in two of your neighboring countries, Ethiopia and Rwanda. So Ethiopia has already many years ago committed 5 million hectares, and they've increased that pledge now to 12 million hectares, which is quite a large part of the country to be restored. And for example, in the Tigray region, if you went there 20 years ago, everything was barren, the last tree cut, everything turned to either fodder or charcoal. And if you go back there now, everything is green, the rivers flow again. With the massive investment and efforts of the government, but also the local communities. The same is happening in Rwanda, where President Kagame has made a very clear pledge to restore all of the landscapes in Rwanda, and with the leadership at the African Union, they're also taking this topic there.
Amazing.
So there are positive
it's good
stories.
to know that there are success stories out there. Now, one final question. I understand that there's a report that is supposed to be released tomorrow. Can you perhaps give us some of the highlights very briefly?
So we've analyzed the 15 years that we've tested this approach of forest and landscape restoration in about 50 countries, and clearly we are now ready to move this up to scale. Our goal is to have 350 million hectares under restoration by 2030. That's an area about the size of India, spread all across the world, and we're sure that we can do this. The report lays out what needs to be done so we can do it. It also puts some figures on this. For example, the combined economic benefit of all this restoration by 2030 in terms of the ecosystem services we can generate is about $9 trillion.
So the government's input in it as well.
The government needs to put some money in. We're also trying to bring more private sector investment into this, because certainly governments cannot shoulder all this cost alone that we have initially, but the benefits will be much greater than the investments. So investing in rural landscape and forest restoration is certainly worthwhile for countries such as Kenya.
Yes, and of course you'll agree with me that the problems when it comes to environment are mainly caused by humans. This is a continent of about 1.2 billion people. In Kenya alone, there are 40 million people and above. Do you think there's enough sensitization out there and the need to conserve environment?
I think that sensitization and awareness is growing. And even among people who are not necessarily in contact with environment issues every day, but everybody feels now that with the extreme weather events, with floods, droughts, climate change is happening, it's real, it's impacting our lives. More and more people are asking themselves, what can I do? And certainly planting more trees on farms, more trees around forests, more trees in cities is one very concrete and good way to start.
Many thanks, Team Christopherson, for your input. And that interview by Team there now takes us to the DRC, I believe.